Welcome to today's podcast, where we delve into one of the most chilling and perplexing murder cases in modern history, the Hella Crafts case, also infamously known as the Woodchipper murder. This case not only shocked the quiet suburb of Newtown, Connecticut, but also made legal history as one of the first cases in the United States to secure a murder conviction without a body. It also served as partial inspiration for the 1996 Coen brothers film Fargo, where a similar, though fictional, crime is depicted. Today, we'll take an in-depth look at the life of Hella Crafts, the gruesome details surrounding her disappearance, the investigation that followed, and how justice was ultimately served. Hella Lork Nielsen was born on July 4, 1947, in Charlottenlund, Denmark, a quiet suburb of Copenhagen. Raised in a middle-class family, Hella's upbringing was stable and loving, giving her a strong foundation. From a young age, Hella was noted for her beauty, intelligence, and ambition, qualities that would later propel her into a successful career. She excelled in school, showing particular talent in languages, becoming fluent in English, French, and German, in addition to her native Danish. Denmark in the 1950s and 1960s was a society undergoing rapid modernization, and Hella, like many young women of her time, was eager to explore the world beyond her homeland. Her proficiency in languages and her adventurous spirit made her well-suited for a career in the aviation industry. After finishing her education, she pursued training as a flight attendant, a prestigious and sought-after profession at the time. By the late 1960s, Hella had joined the ranks of Pan American World Airways Pan Am, one of the most esteemed airlines in the world. Working for Pan Am was more than just a job for Hella, it was a gateway to the world. She traveled extensively, visiting countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Her colleagues and passengers alike were charmed by her professionalism, grace, and friendliness. Despite the demands of the job, Hella loved the excitement of travel and the opportunities it provided to meet new people and experience different cultures. Hella's career as a flight attendant also allowed her to build a comfortable life for herself. She enjoyed the financial independence her job provided and was well liked by her peers. However, her work also brought her into contact with many different individuals, one of whom would eventually become her husband, Richard Crafts. In 1969, during one of her flights, Hella met Richard Crafts, a pilot for Eastern Airlines. Richard was 9 years older than Hella, and he had already lived an eventful life. Born in New York City in 1937, Richard grew up in a strict and somewhat troubled household. His father, who worked in advertising, was known to be authoritarian, which may have influenced Richard's later need for control. Richard was a complex individual, marked by a duality that would come to define his later actions. On one hand, he was a decorated Vietnam War veteran, having served as a Marine Corps helicopter pilot during the conflict. His military background gave him a certain level of discipline and respectability. On the other hand, Richard had a darker side. He was known to be emotionally distant, secretive, and obsessed with collecting firearms and knives. His fascination with weapons hinted at a more sinister aspect of his personality. Despite the warning signs, Hella was drawn to Richard's confidence and worldly experience. Their shared connection to the aviation industry also provided common ground for their relationship to develop. After a brief courtship, Richard and Hella married in 1975. Following their marriage, Richard and Hella settled in Newtown, Connecticut, a picturesque and affluent suburb. They purchased a spacious house and began building what appeared to be an idyllic family life. Over the next several years, the Crafts had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Hella continued to work as a flight attendant, while Richard maintained his career as a pilot for Eastern Airlines. To their neighbors, the Crafts seemed like the perfect family. They lived in a well-kept home in a quiet, safe community, and they were seen as a typical suburban couple raising their children. However, behind closed doors, the reality was far more troubling. Richard's controlling nature began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. He was possessive of Hella and often monitored her movements. His mood swings, coupled with his growing interest in weapons, created a tense and fearful environment at home. Richard's absences due to his job were frequent, and during these times, Hella enjoyed a sense of temporary relief. However, Richard's behavior when he was home became more erratic. He was prone to sudden outbursts of anger, and Hella's friends later reported that she often appeared nervous and on edge. Hella confided in some of her closest friends that Richard had become emotionally and, at times, physically abusive. Despite this, Hella was determined to keep her family together, primarily for the sake of her children. As the years went by, the pressures of domestic life and Richard's increasingly erratic behavior began to take a toll on Hella. She loved her children deeply and was dedicated to providing them with a stable home, but the cracks in her marriage were widening. Richard's controlling behavior escalated to the point where Hella felt isolated and trapped. Friends would later recall how Hella seemed increasingly anxious and fearful. But she was determined to keep up appearances for the sake of her children. Richard's behavior was becoming more erratic, fueled by his obsessive need for control and his extramarital affairs. Hella, who had once been vibrant and full of life, was now living in fear. She was no longer just dealing with an unfaithful husband, but a man who seemed capable of far worse. Despite her fears, Hella began to take steps to protect herself and her children, including seeking legal advice about a divorce. By 1986, Hella Crafts had reached a breaking point. She had discovered that Richard was having multiple affairs and had even hired a private investigator, Keith Mayo, to gather evidence of his infidelity. Hella was meticulous and cautious in her approach, understanding the potential dangers of confronting Richard directly. She shared her fears with close friends, expressing that if anything were to happen to her, it would not be an accident. Hella was well aware of the precarious situation she was in, and she began taking steps to protect herself legally and financially. Armed with evidence of Richard's infidelity, Hella filed for divorce in September 1986. However, the divorce process was slow, and Hella remained in the house with Richard and their children, which created an incredibly tense and hostile environment. Hella continued working as a flight attendant during this time, but she was also carefully planning her next moves. She consulted with her lawyer about the divorce proceedings and began discussing the possibility of moving out with her children. Hella was determined to start a new life free from Richard's control, but tragically, she would never get the chance. On the evening of November 18, 1986, a severe snowstorm hit Connecticut, covering the town of Newtown in a thick blanket of snow. Hella had just returned home from a flight and was last seen by her friends and coworkers when she was dropped off at her house around 7 p.m. Despite the weather, Hella was in good spirits, and she mentioned to her colleagues that she was looking forward to spending some time with her children. However, that was the last time anyone saw Hella Crafts alive. The following morning, November 19, 1986, a close friend of Hella's, who was also her nanny, came to the Crafts' home as usual to help with the children. The nanny noticed that Hella was nowhere to be found, but Richard was home and claimed that Hella had left early that morning for an unexpected trip to Denmark to visit her sick mother. This explanation seemed odd to the nanny, as Hella had not mentioned any such plans the previous day. Over the next few days, Hella's friends and coworkers grew increasingly concerned when she failed to show up for work or contact anyone. They reached out to Richard, who repeated his story about Hella's trip to Denmark. However, when Hella's friends contacted her family in Denmark, they learned that Hella had never arrived. The growing inconsistencies in Richard's story alarmed her friends, who feared the worst. The police were first contacted by Hella's friends, who expressed their concerns about her sudden disappearance. Initially, the police treated the case as a missing person investigation. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, and Richard Crafts, when questioned, seemed unconcerned about his wife's absence. He insisted that she was visiting her sick mother in Denmark and would return soon. However, Richard's calm demeanor and vague explanations did little to alleviate the fears of those who knew Hella well. One of Hella's closest friends and confidants, who was aware of the tumultuous state of her marriage, pressed the police to take a closer look. She informed them about the ongoing divorce proceedings and Hella's fear of Richard. This prompted the police to begin a more thorough investigation. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and colleagues of Hella and Richard, all of whom painted a picture of a troubled marriage and a woman who had become increasingly fearful for her life. Despite these concerns, the lack of physical evidence made it difficult for the police to take immediate action. Without a body or clear signs of a struggle, the case remained classified as a missing person investigation. However, as the days passed and no word came from Hella, the situation grew more ominous. As the investigation into Hella's disappearance continued, Richard Kraft's behavior became increasingly suspicious. He remained calm and collected, even as the police began to ask more pointed questions. He showed little concern for Hella's whereabouts and continued with his daily routines as if nothing had happened. This behavior struck investigators as odd, especially given the serious nature of his wife's disappearance. Friends and neighbors also noticed strange behavior from Richard in the days following Hella's disappearance. He was seen using Hella's credit cards and withdrawing large sums of money from their joint accounts. Additionally, Richard began making inquiries about selling the family home, which raised red flags given that Hella had been missing for only a short time. These actions suggested that Richard might have been preparing for a future without his wife. Keith Mayo, the private investigator Hella had hired to follow Richard and gather evidence of his infidelity, played a crucial role in the investigation. Mayo was convinced from the beginning that Richard was involved in Hella's disappearance. He knew how fearful Hella had been of her husband and how desperate she was to escape the marriage. Mayo had already compiled extensive evidence of Richard's affairs, but now he began to focus on finding out what had happened to Hella. Mayo took his concerns to the police, sharing his belief that Richard had murdered his wife. He urged them to investigate Richard's recent activities more thoroughly, particularly in the days immediately following Hella's disappearance. Mayo's persistence and his knowledge of the Crafts' troubled marriage added a sense of urgency to the investigation. The case took a significant turn when a local snowplow driver came forward with a startling piece of information. The driver, who had been working during the snowstorm on the night of November 18, 1986, reported seeing Richard Crafts operating a woodchipper near Lake Zor in the early hours of November 20, 1986. The sighting was unusual given the severe weather conditions and the late hour. The snowplow driver's testimony raised immediate suspicions. Why would Richard be using a woodchipper in the middle of a snowstorm? The driver's account provided a critical lead, and investigators quickly zeroed in on the area near Lake Zor where Richard had been seen. Following the snowplow driver's tip, the police conducted a search of the area near Lake Zor. They discovered small pieces of metal, fabric, and other unidentified fragments scattered along the banks of the Housatonic River. The investigators' suspicions grew as they realized that these fragments could potentially be linked to Hella's disappearance. The woodchipper itself was located and seized as evidence. It was clear that the machine had been used recently, and investigators began to piece together a horrifying theory. Richard Crafts had murdered his wife and used the woodchipper to dispose of her body, scattering the remains into the river during the snowstorm to cover his tracks. The police launched a thorough search of the area, and forensic experts were brought in to examine the fragments found at the scene. Over the next several days, investigators recovered more than 2,600 hairs, a fingernail, several human bone fragments, a portion of a human tooth, and tissue, all of which were sent to the state forensic lab for analysis. The forensic analysis was painstakingly detailed. The hairs were microscopically examined and compared to samples from Hella's hairbrush. The bone fragments were identified as human, specifically fragments from a skull. The tooth fragment, when analyzed by a forensic odontologist, was matched to Hella's dental records. This was one of the most crucial pieces of evidence, as it directly linked the remains to Hella Crafts. In addition to the human remains, the forensic team also found blue fibers and other fabric remnants that matched the nightgown Hella was known to have been wearing the night she disappeared. These findings, when combined with the human remains, provided compelling evidence that Hella had been killed and her body dismembered using the woodchipper. With this overwhelming forensic evidence in hand, the police were now confident that Hella Crafts had been murdered, and they had enough to arrest Richard Crafts. On January 13, 1987, Richard was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. He maintained his innocence, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and that Hella had simply left him. Richard's arrest sent shockwaves through the community of Newtown. The idea that a seemingly ordinary man could commit such a heinous act against his wife was difficult for many to comprehend. However, as the details of the case began to emerge, it became clear that this was not just a case of domestic violence, but a meticulously planned and cold-blooded murder. The trial of Richard Crafts was groundbreaking in many ways. It was one of the first cases in the United States where a murder conviction was sought without the recovery of a full body. The prosecution faced the daunting task of convincing a jury that Hella Crafts had been murdered despite the lack of a traditional corpse, relying heavily on forensic evidence and circumstantial details. The absence of a body posed significant legal challenges. The defense, led by attorney Eugene Riccio, argued that without a body, it was impossible to definitively prove that Hella was dead, let alone that Richard was responsible for her death. Riccio questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence, particularly the hair and tissue samples, and suggested that the entire case was based on speculation. Prosecutor Walter Flanagan and his team knew that they had to build a compelling narrative to overcome the challenge of a no-body case. They meticulously presented the forensic evidence, demonstrating how the fragments found near Lake Zor could only belong to Hella Crafts. The prosecution also emphasized the circumstantial evidence, such as Richard's suspicious behavior, the financial transactions, and the damning testimony from the snowplow driver. The prosecution called numerous witnesses to the stand, including forensic experts who testified about the evidence found at the scene, and friends of Hella who recounted her fears and the deteriorating state of her marriage. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the woodchipper itself, which was brought into the courtroom. The prosecution also conducted a demonstration showing how woodchippers could reduce large objects to unrecognizable fragments, helping the jury understand how Richard could have disposed of Hella's body. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came when the prosecution demonstrated the use of a woodchipper. The jury was taken to a location where they watched as a similar woodchipper to the one used by Richard Crafts was employed to shred large objects, including animal carcasses, to simulate what could have happened to Hella's body. The demonstration was gruesome but effective, driving home the point that a woodchipper could indeed reduce a human body to small, unidentifiable fragments. The prosecution also introduced expert testimony on how bone fragments, teeth, and hair could survive the chipping process, further supporting their theory that the remains found near Lake Zor belonged to Hella Crafts. This demonstration, combined with the forensic evidence, helped to solidify the prosecution's case. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and that there was no direct proof that Hella was dead. Riccio suggested alternative explanations for Hella's disappearance, including the possibility that she had run away to start a new life. He also attacked the credibility of the forensic evidence, arguing that it was not definitive enough to confirm that the remains were Hella's. Riccio pointed out that there were no witnesses to the murder and no direct evidence linking Richard to the crime. He suggested that Hella, who was unhappy in her marriage and stressed by the impending divorce, might have staged her disappearance. The defense also questioned the reliability of the snowplow driver's testimony, suggesting that it was too vague and unreliable to be a key piece of evidence. The trial, which began in May 1988, captivated the nation. However, it ended in a mistrial after the jury became deadlocked, with one juror refusing to convict Richard Crafts. The deadlock was a major setback for the prosecution, who had hoped for a swift conviction. The juror in question reportedly had doubts about the forensic evidence and was not convinced that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The mistrial meant that the case would have to be retried, and the prosecution knew that they needed to present an even stronger case the second time around. They spent the next several months refining their arguments, gathering additional evidence, and preparing for a retrial. The case was retried in September 1989, and this time, the prosecution's case was presented more clearly, with additional expert testimony to bolster the forensic evidence. The prosecution was determined to leave no doubt in the minds of the jurors that Richard Crafts was guilty of murdering his wife. The second trial saw the introduction of new evidence, including more detailed forensic analysis and additional witness testimony. The prosecution also did a better job of addressing the defense's arguments, systematically dismantling each of Riccio's claims. The jury was presented with a more cohesive narrative that clearly laid out the timeline of events, the evidence linking Richard to the crime, and the implausibility of any alternative explanations. On November 21, 1989, after several days of deliberation, the jury found Richard Crafts guilty of murder. The verdict was a relief for Hella's family and friends, who had waited years for justice to be served. Richard was sentenced to 50 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was insufficient given the heinous nature of the crime. However, the conviction was a landmark in legal history, setting a precedent for future cases where a body is not recovered. The jury's decision was seen as a victory for forensic science and a testament to the power of circumstantial evidence. It also sent a clear message that even in the absence of a body, justice could still be achieved. Richard Crafts was led away in handcuffs, his demeanor as calm and emotionless as it had been throughout the trial. The Hella Crafts case had a profound impact on the field of forensic science. It demonstrated the importance of forensic evidence in cases where a body is not recovered and highlighted the potential for modern technology to solve crimes that might otherwise go unsolved. The case also underscored the significance of trace evidence, showing that even the smallest fragments can provide crucial links in a criminal investigation. The success of the prosecution in the Crafts case also encouraged law enforcement agencies to invest more heavily in forensic science. Advances in DNA analysis, forensic odontology, and trace evidence examination have all been spurred by cases like this one, where traditional investigative methods alone might not have been sufficient to secure a conviction. The legal implications of the Hella Crafts case were significant. It set a precedent for no-body murder cases, proving that a conviction could be obtained even without the recovery of a victim's body. This has had a lasting impact on how such cases are prosecuted, giving hope to families of missing persons and providing law enforcement with a framework for pursuing justice in similar cases. The case also highlighted the importance of circumstantial evidence, while direct evidence like a body or a murder weapon is always preferred. The Crafts case showed that a well-constructed circumstantial case could be just as powerful. This has influenced how prosecutors approach complex cases and how they present evidence to juries. Richard Crafts has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. He served his sentence at various correctional facilities in Connecticut. His lack of remorse and continued denial of his involvement in his wife's murder only added to the horror of the crime in the eyes of the public. In 2020, Richard Crafts was released from prison after serving over 30 years of his sentence, a development that reignited public interest in the case. His release was met with outrage by many who felt that justice had not been fully served. However, given the time he had already served, the legal system allowed for his release. The Hella Crafts case not only had a significant impact on forensic science and criminal law, but also left its mark on popular culture. The Coen brothers' 1996 film Fargo features a scene in which a character uses a woodchipper to dispose of a body. While the film's plot is fictional, the woodchipper scene was directly inspired by the real-life details of the Hella Crafts case. This chilling imagery has since become one of the most iconic moments in film history, further embedding Hella Crafts' tragic story into the public consciousness. As we reflect on the Hella Crafts case, it's clear that it is more than just a story of a brutal murder. It is a tale of perseverance by those who sought justice for Hella, of the advancements in forensic science that made it possible to convict a killer without a body, and of the legal battles that pushed the boundaries of criminal law. The case also serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the lengths to which abusers will go to maintain control over their victims. Hella's story is a tragic example of what can happen when warning signs are ignored, and it underscores the importance of taking threats of violence seriously. The Hella Crafts case remains one of the most infamous murder cases in American history, not just for its gruesome details, but for the legal and forensic precedents it set. It serves as a grim reminder of the darker sides of human nature, the fragility of life, and the relentless pursuit of justice by those who refuse to let the truth be buried, even when the body is not found. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the most chilling and historically significant cases of the 20th century. As always, stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember the lessons learned from stories like these. Until next time, signing off.